Thank you, worship team. If you have your Bibles, please turn to Esther chapter 1. We started our study last week, and we're actually going to get into the book this week. And we're going to be talking about the unseen hand of God and the details of Esther's life. And when I was thinking about this, it made me go back to what I had done a few weeks ago, seeing the preparation for this upcoming year and having to make some decisions for the church. I went back and looked over my journal notes about the church. And yeah, I journal. Maybe you don't. The reason I journal is because my mind, I forget things real easy, especially lessons that God has taught me. So it's been nice to go back. And I'm going through my notes. You know what stuck out to me? Was how clear it was to see God's providential hand, the details in the establishment of Truth and Grace Fellowship. You know, at the time that we were going through this, I didn't fully understand what God was doing. I didn't have clarity on seeing how He was orchestrating everything according to His purpose and plan. But it was so obvious to see His unseen hand moving everything along to where we're at today. What I want to do is give you a few examples of how God did that. And you'll see why I'm sharing this, because it's going to be at the heart of our story today about the book of Esther. But what's interesting, when I was going through these notes, I realized, man, God had been doing this before the concept or idea of Truth and Grace Fellowship was even there. You see, 6 years ago, I had gotten hired as a professor, not knowing that during that time I'd become good friends with Melissa Fowler. And so for 6 years, before I'd go teach my class or after, I'd go down and Melissa would have these conversations. And I'd always tell Melissa, I said, Melissa, I don't know why I'm telling you this, but I just believe that God has told me we're going to be doing ministry together. And year after year, we'd have those same conversations. We'd smile, and we'd say, we know. And hard to believe what God did over those 6 years. And I remember sitting with my wife and Garrett and Molly, and we knew God had told us to start a church. That the response by all three of them to me was, well, you know, the first phone call Melissa to be our worship leader. And it was amazing to see God working in those details 6 years ago. And in fact, I saw another detail as well. About a year before we started Truth and Grace, I had been offered to be a pastor in another church. And we had prayed and really wrestled with that decision and just felt like, Lord, if you're opening this door up, I don't want to be resistant to what you have. So I had a meeting, and really the meeting was, I thought, was more of a formality. If you want it, BJ, it's yours, just put your name down and we'll move forward. And so as I go into that meeting, just pretty much planning on doing that, God had a different plan, because as we're talking, He said, I just want to let you know I found someone else for the job. As I walked away, I said, God, what are you doing? You know, here I am faithfully trying to respond to the doors that I believe you're opening up. I'm trying to be faithful what you've called me, but not knowing at that moment what God was doing behind the scenes in my life. But it's also the same thing in this church. Because there it was that day, and I can still picture that day like it was yesterday, that I'm in my office with my dad at the ministry, just having a normal day, and then all of a sudden Pastor Chuck walks in. He begins to tell my dad and myself that, look, I'm at a point in my life where I need to start figuring out what God has for the church. And as we're having this conversation, we're both in agreement. Heck, yeah, this sounds like a great idea. You know, as a ministry, you can come in here, we can do Bible studies or whatever. And he literally is walking out the door, and I believe the Holy Spirit prompted him, because he turned around and said, I'll tell you what, I'll give you the church for free, but this man right here, and he pointed at me and said, he will be the pastor. And at that moment, neither myself nor Pastor Chuck knew what that encounter meant, what God was going to do through it. Some other things where I saw God working was as God was building up our Bible study in our home, and we felt this urge to really want to start a church, we weren't sure where we were going to go. You see, although Pastor Chuck had approached me, there was still prayer that he needed to do about what God was calling him to do. And so as he was praying, we actually reached out to another church and said, hey, here's where we're at. Would you be interested if we transition out there and look for a future opportunity for us to take over? Because the church didn't have many people left. So we drive out and we look at it. I'm looking at this church and I'm saying, God, man, look at what we could do. Look at the property. Look at everything that we can do. I can see the vision of this church and what I could just see so many great things happening. And so we're all excited about it. We prayed that night. The next day we get a phone call from the church. And they said we had a vote as a congregation. And although as the pastor I support it, the congregation does not. And the reason they were given, it might shock you, they said that the floors we just paid the floors to be waxed, and we don't want your group to scuff up our floors. You know, yeah, it may sound funny, but I'm like, Lord, once again, what are you doing? You're calling me to establish this church in every way. I see doors open, but then as the door opens, it slams in my face. I'm like, God, what are you doing? And we often get there, don't we? And so after that moment, I ended up calling Pastor Chuck. I said, Pastor Chuck, I just got to be honest with you. Where my wife and I are at, we believe God has called me to be a pastor, and we'd like to have more conversations. And he said, BJ, I would love to just tell you can have it, but I have to have a vote with my congregation, which was IHS at that time. And as we're waiting for that vote, my friend who was another pastor said, BJ, I just wanted you to be up front. We went through this ourselves, and it is a mess. You'll never get full support. People will rise up to oppose it. They'll find anything they can to criticize. And he goes, you just need to be prepared that this is going to be a long process. This isn't going to happen overnight. And after that vote, Chuck called me the next day and said, BJ, I just want to let you know, 100% support. You see, God was moving in the hearts of IHS to not know what was going to happen, but He knew what He wanted to accomplish. And I go through some other stories here, is that here we are as a church. We don't have a mother church, so guess what? We have no money to start this church. It's like, okay, Lord, what are we going to do? And some guy just says, God has just led me to say, here's money. Go get the church started. Then I was thinking about as the church is growing and we had these pews here. And by the way, I'm not against pews, but the pews weren't able to accommodate the number of people coming. We're like, what are we going to do? It's our first Christmas service. And at that time, we were only 2 services. So like, how are we going to accommodate everybody? And so we called to order chairs. I think it was in November. And we said, we need to buy Christmas. They started laughing. They said, look, these are back ordered. You'll be lucky to get them in 3 months. And so we're like, Lord, it's in your hands. We'll figure this out. And about 2 weeks before Christmas, we get a phone call. The company said, someone just canceled an order. The chairs can be there next week. Then I think about this addition that we want to do, and we began to start praying about it, and all of a sudden come to find out we're facing some serious zoning laws, that these laws would hinder us from doing any expansion here. And I was talking to people who were much wiser about zoning laws than myself, and they just said, look, the purpose of zoning laws are not to be changed. They're there to stay in place. They said, you're going to have an uphill battle. And so once again, I went to the Lord in prayer, and you know what God did? He raised up people at the right moment to be advocates for us. And that night, we had people reach out to that zoning board. So we went the next day, not knowing what to expect. And as I began to share with them what God's vision was for Truth and Grace, what was going on, you know what happened? They went back into the room for 15 minutes and came out and says, you receive 100% support from us. Go forward. God is good in the details of life. And the reason why I share that is not just to encourage you about what God's unseen hand was in the details of our church, but that is what we're going to see in Esther. That there's this unseen hand of God moving every detail of her life, leading to her to exactly where He needs her. But I'll just say this, the unseen hand of God is not just in this church, and it's not just in the story of Esther. His unseen hand is also working in your life right now. And I pray that as we go through these first 2 chapters, that it's going to transform the way that you see where you're at and how you see your circumstances, and while you clearly cannot see what God is doing, what the end result is, you can step away and say, God, even though you seem to be absent, you are ever present, and I see what you are doing, and I know I can trust you. So what I want to do before we jump into Esther, I promise you we'll get there. I know we didn't get there last week. I want to do a review, and maybe the review is, and there's a picture of the church, maybe the review is more for people who weren't here last week to get you caught up, but I want you to see in this review about how God is behind the details of everything that He's doing in the nation of Israel. And so we talked last week, and I'll do it very short, that God goes into a covenant relationship with Abraham. And we see the promise that He gives Abraham in Genesis chapter 15, but as He gives him these promises, He reveals His law to the people through Moses. And we saw that law came with it, that there's blessings if you obey it, but there are curses if you disobey it. And one of those curses was that God says, I will remove you from the land. And after a continual pattern of disobedience, God stays faithful to what He said, and He removes them from the land. But we often think, well, how did God do that? Well, you know what? This is the beauty of God. Because God is maneuvering people to do what He's called them to do. And so we go to 2 Chronicles chapter 36. I just want to read a few verses here. It says, the Lord, the God of their fathers, sent persistently to them by His messengers because He had compassion on His people and on His dwelling places. But they kept scoffing or mocking the messengers of God, despising His word and scoffing at His prophets until the wrath of the Lord rose against the people until there was no remedy. Now what do you see God doing? His patience, continual warning to them over and over again. But after that finally comes to the point where they reject Him, God says, fine, then I have to move. But what does God do in the next verses, which one I want you to really hear? He says, therefore He, referring to God, brought up against them the king of the Chaldeans, which is just another word for Babylonians. In other words, the most powerful man at that time, you know what God did? He says, I will use us as my vessel to bring about my purpose and plan for my people. Yes, it was a purpose of judgment here, but God says, I will bring him to do what I need him to do. And so here comes the Chaldeans or the Babylonians as we come to know them more often, and they came and they conquered the Jewish people and they took them into captivity. We call it the Babylonian exile. And for 70 years they would remain there. And as they remained there, Babylon, the greatest empire at that time, was conquered by the Persian Empire. And the beauty of it is, despite their unfaithfulness, God remained faithful to His promise that He gave Abraham. And so as we read last week in Ezra 1:1, what does God do? He literally stirs up the spirit of Cyrus, king of Persia, to issue a decree to have the people go back to their land. While some returned, there was others like Esther who stayed and remained in Persia. That sets the context for our book. Why do I show you that? Because I want you to be very clear here. God is in every single detail. He's been there from the very beginning, but we see in the nation of Israel that them being in Persia, He has led every little detail, and He's maneuvering the greatest powers in the world to accomplish His purposes. And now we're going to see as we go into Esther how God is working the details of her life. But I have to make one key point before we jump into chapter 1. Because how does God do this? And so within the few minutes I have, I'm going to solve one of the greatest theological problems, right? You can smile because you know it's not going to happen. It's God's sovereignty, human freedom. How do these work together? How do we understand that? One of the questions I get asked all the time, how do we understand that God is sovereign, yet we have choices? So let's just try to define some terms. What does it mean when I say that God is sovereign? It means that He has complete authority. That means that outside of remaining faithful to who He is, He's not limited by anything or anybody. He's not waiting around for us to figure things out and, well, I'm waiting for them to figure out what they're going to do, then I'm going to respond or react to whatever they do. That's not the God that we serve. God knows the end from the beginning. And listen, the decisions that you and I make, whether they're today, tomorrow, or next week, will in no way hinder what He is determined to accomplish. He is sovereign. He's bound by nothing but by who He is as a person. However, the mystery of how He brings about His will is that He does it through our choices that we make, both good and bad. So perhaps the question isn't how does God's sovereignty work with man's freedom? Maybe the greater question is how are our choices used to fulfill God's purposes? Because I want to be very clear, and I mentioned last week that when we discussed that every choice that we make in life has a consequence, right? There's choices you're making right now that have the consequence of receiving God's blessing, experience His presence, and seeing the joy of being part of the plan He has for you. But there are also the consequences of disobedience, those curses that come in where we miss out on what God had planned for us. But either way, God's plan will be unfolded regardless of how we choose to respond. And I want you to keep this in mind because what we're going to see at the heart of Esther is God's plan unfolding through their good and bad choices. And that through the main characters, as they make these choices and the consequences that come from it, that God is leading and directing everything according to what He had planned. So now, after much excitement, right? Now we're going to jump into chapter 1. And I just want to point out, we're not going to look at every single verse. But I'll take chunks out and give you some perspective on those. That's why I encourage you every week to read on your own through the book of Esther. So let's take a look at verse 1 and 2. It says, now in the days of Ahasuerus, the Ahasuerus who reigned from India to Ethiopia over 127 provinces, in those days, when King Ahasuerus sat on his royal throne in Susa, the citadel. Now I'm going to stop right here because we get the very first character of our book, Ahasuerus. And I'm just going to point out that I'm going to refer to him by a different name, by his Greek name Xerxes. Because besides the fact it's easier for me to say, I think it's kind of a cool name, Xerxes. Much better than Ahasuerus. And so what do we know about Xerxes? Well, he was the son of the Persian king Darius. And many of you who have read the book of Daniel have encountered Darius. Read Daniel chapter 6. He was the Persian king while Daniel was there serving. And guess who his mother was? The daughter of Cyrus the Great, the king who sent Israel back to the promised land. So it gives you a little bit of a background for him. And this is what we know about Xerxes. He inherited a strong empire from his father. In fact, this is what scholars tell us, that the empire at that time was 2.9 million square miles that extended from India to North Africa. And they tell us that the size of that empire at the time he was in power would have covered roughly 44% of the world's population at that time. This is how powerful and how influential his empire was. However, what we find out, the great leadership ability of his father was sadly not passed on to Xerxes. He was a cruel and a weak ruler, and we'll see this throughout the book of Esther. And here in the opening chapter, what do we see Xerxes? He is on his throne in Susa, which served as a winter palace for the kings of Persia. Now, many of you are looking at me and saying, well, why are you telling me all the details about him? You already went through history last week. Well, you want to know what I want to tell you about him and the historical understanding? Besides the fact that when you study a book of the Bible, you need to know the background and context, there's another reason why I'm telling you about him. Because I want you to understand, today we're not looking at a story that's a myth or a fable or some fairy tale. We're looking at a historical story that actually happened. So we move on to verse 3. And this is what it says. In the 3rd year of his reign, he gave a feast for all of his officials and servants. The army of Persia and Media and the nobles and the governors of the province were before him. And while he showed the riches of his royal glory and the splendor and pomp of his greatness for many days, it says for 180 days. So here's Xerxes. He's having a banquet, a party, a feast for all of his officials, all his attendants, for all the army officers throughout that whole entire empire. He says, come and let's just have a blast. And we don't know the whole reason why he had it. Scholars tell us it could be two. First of all, early in his reign, he had to deal with some rebellions that happened in the areas of Egypt and Babylon against his authority, and he successfully stopped them. So maybe he's celebrating his victories. But what scholars tell us too is that he was about to prepare a massive launch or a massive military campaign against Greece. And so perhaps in these 180 days, not only is he celebrating what he's going to see as a future victory, but he's preparing his soldiers for the game plan of how they're going to do that. But for 180 days, he displays all his riches and all his glory. And this is not out of character for Xerxes. Because one thing we know about him, he loved to build lavish buildings. He loved to brag about how rich and powerful he was. And you know what he did it at? He did all this at the expense of his subjects, who he taxed very heavily. If you really want to summarize Xerxes, he was a man who liked to party and spend money. Then as we go into verse 5 through 8, if we're not done having a good time for 180 days, it says he has a second banquet. And we'll see in the book of Esther that the Persians just loved to have big banquets and feasts, didn't they? And the description of this banquet gives us some details about the wealth and opulence of this empire. But I want to point out, in the midst of all his wealth and opulence, it may be, yes, maybe he had these parties because he wanted to celebrate his victories or what he thought would be a future victory against Greece. But you want to know what the motivation behind these were? They came out of Xerxes' pride and arrogance. And before we move on, I want to point out something very powerful to all of you, that pride is destructive. In fact, this is what we're told in Proverbs 11:2, that when pride comes, then comes disgrace, but with the humble is wisdom. Xerxes' life is a reminder that if we boast about ourselves and we're proud, that we will be humbled. Because you know what happens a few years later? He goes off and takes a superior army to defeat the Greeks, and he is not only defeated, but he's humiliated. And he comes back as a defeated ruler, and you know what happens a few years after that? He is eventually assassinated by one of his assistants. I warn you today that if there's any pride in your heart, to get rid of it. Because it'll destroy you and what God can do in your life. As Christians, we are not called to boast and brag, but we are called to have a humble heart like Jesus Christ, who, what does Philippians chapter 2 tell us? And read that whole chapter. It says he humbled himself and became obedient to the point of a servant. And he gave up his life for us. That is the heart that we are to have as Christians. Because I look out here right now and I've seen some of the greatest men fall because of pride, both in the church and outside the church. And today I'm calling all of us to have a heart of humility, to humble ourselves before the Lord. Because when we choose to humble ourselves before the Lord, not only will God be exalted in our life, but you know what? God will also exalt us as well. So heed the words of Xerxes, a reminder of the dangers of what happens when we let pride get into our heart. We go on to verse 9. We're getting the next main character of the story is Queen Vashti. And along with the king, we find that she's having a banquet or a feast for the women of the palace. And so as these parties are going on, now we're going to see the very first key event happen in our story, which occurs in verses 10 and 11. This is the first main event. It says, on the 7th day, when the heart of the king was merry with wine, he commanded, and he gives the list of their names, these 7 eunuchs. What's a eunuch? A eunuch was someone who's set apart from birth to serve the needs of the king. And so these eunuchs were told to bring Queen Vashti before the king with her royal crown, in order to show the peoples and the princes her beauty, for she was lovely to look at. So what's going on here? Well, I'll tell you what's going on. You ever heard of the term trophy wife? Yeah, you've heard of that term. That's what Xerxes is doing. He wants to have his trophy wife come out. He wants to display her before him and all of his drunk friends. Well, I want to just be quite clear with you that there is no honor in what Xerxes is calling his wife to do. We don't know the exact details. The passage doesn't tell us, but it seems to be at some level there's going to be some presentation or being displayed in some way that she has to become immodest in front of these people. And because of this, we get a very clear response in verse 12 of what she says, and this is what goes on. It says, "But Queen Vashti refused to come at the king's command, delivered by the eunuchs. And this the king became enraged, and his anger burned within him." Now, none of us here can disagree with her response. This refusal to be degraded in a room full of drunk men. In fact, I believe her decision was honorable. Not to compromise herself at the hands of an arrogant and prideful king. Who at that point, you know what he should have been doing? Xerxes should have been protecting his wife's beauty rather than displaying his wife's beauty. And I want to make a very important side note before I move on, because I don't want you to take this out of context, because Scripture is very clear. We are called to submit to those in authority. Today it may not be popular, but yes, wives, you are to submit to your husbands, children to submit to their parents, employees, you are to submit to the authority of your boss, and yes, we are all to submit to those who are ruling and reigning in Washington, D.C. right now. But while we are called to submit to those in authority, there's proper biblical submission. So right now, I don't know who that authority figure is, but I'll tell you, proper biblical submission means this: you never submit to those who call you to do that which is wrong before the Lord. What I want to say to all the women in this room, and I see a lot of young women too, listen, do not ever compromise your convictions before the Lord for a man. Seek a man, young ladies, who has a heart for God, who will honor you because he sees you as a treasured gift that was given to him by you. And men today, we are called to love the women in our lives. Your mother, your wife, your children, whoever it may be. And you might look at me and say, BJ, how do I love the women in my life? You want to know how to love them? Love them like Christ loved the church. And how did he love the church? He gave his very life for her. You see, men, it is our job in this world today to protect and to make sure that we uphold the integrity and value of our wives and the other women in our lives. May we not carry the spirit of Xerxes into our day today, but we preserve what God has given us and treasure that as a gift from him. Well, I hope and pray that you agree with God's perspective on this. Xerxes does not. Because we see his response to Vashti's decision, and it says that he becomes enraged and burned with anger. And now we know the Old Testament is written in Hebrew, so what do these terms mean? It's very clear. He is full of rage like a consuming fire. What we find here is that Xerxes' pride and arrogance not only led him to dishonor his wife, but now it's leading him to turn against her with rage. In the remaining verses of chapter 1, what do we see? That Xerxes approaches his advisors about how to deal with Queen Vashti. And when we go to verse 19, we are given the advice from one of his advisors, and this is what it says. If it please the king, let a royal order go out from him. Let it be written among the laws of the Persians and Medes so that it may not be replaced, that Vashti is never again to come before King Xerxes. Let the king give a royal position to another who is better than she. And as we see in verse 21, what's the response of the king and the princes? That they agree with what this counsel has been given. But before we move on to chapter 2, I want to stop for a second. I want us to think about what has happened. Where are we at? Because the power of what's going on is that we have this powerful king. We've got this queen. We've got all these eunuchs who are advising him. And what's amazing about this, unknown to all of them and all their choices, that God is working everything out to fulfill his plans for the Jewish people. They have no clue what's going on. But God is working through their decisions to lead them to where he wants to accomplish his plans. And not once, we've talked about this before, that God's name is mentioned in the book of Esther. But as we continue on, what do we see? God's unseen hand in moving everything along. Specifically for what? To place Esther exactly where God needs her. You see, right now you may be going through the same thing. You're like, God, I do not see your hand. I don't know what's going on. But I'll tell you what, God is moving in your life like He was in the life of Esther. And the question before you is, how are you going to make your choices be used by God to bring about His plan? As we continue on to chapter 2, I want you to keep these words in mind. These are words most likely written by Solomon. Solomon, a great, powerful king of Israel, who, by the way, was considered to be the wisest man ever. This is what Solomon says about how God moves kings to do what He wants. This is Proverbs 21:1. It says, the king's heart is a stream of water in the hand of the Lord. He turns it wherever He wills or pleases. Do you hear the power of that? That means the greatest people from the time that human history has been to the very present, they sit on their thrones like King Xerxes. They boast and brag about all their great glories, all they want to accomplish. And God is stepping back and saying, do you not know that I'm the one in control, that you could do nothing outside of my authority? If that is a truth about the people that rule on their thrones today, what does that mean about the God that we serve in regards to the details of your life? If God can move the kings like He can move water, do you not think He can move in your life to bring things out for His purpose and His glory? I pray, ladies and gentlemen, you change the perspective of how you see your life. Not through the lenses of the circumstances or through the lenses of those around you, but you say, I'm going to see this through the lenses of God Himself. That the God that I serve is on His throne. And not only can He move the king to do whatever I want, He can change the circumstances of my life for His glory and for His honor. It's the God that we serve. And I want you to keep that in mind, because here we go to chapter 2, and it's in the very first 4 verses that sets the context for the next key event. Vashti has been removed. Now we see the next key event after that. And it says this, after these things, when the anger of King Xerxes had abated, he remembered Vashti and what she had done and what had been decreed against her. Then the king's young men who attended him said, let beautiful young virgins be sought out for the king. And let the king appoint officers in all the provinces of his kingdom to gather all the beautiful young virgins to the harem in Susa, the citadel, under the custody of Haggai, the king's eunuch, who is in charge of the women. Let their cosmetics be given them, and let the young woman who pleases the king be queen instead of Vashti. And this pleased the king and did so. So after these things, you know what it's referring to? The scholars tell us it's probably 4 years from the events that happened in chapter 1. And in those 4 years, from a historical standpoint, that's when Xerxes would have went to Greece, proud and boastful that he would conquer them, and now he's coming back as a defeated king, humiliated. And in the midst of that moment, you know what he remembers? I need to find a replacement for Vashti. And let's not sit here and think that that was motivated just because of whatever reason. God is moving in his mind and his heart to do what he's called him to do. And so what is the plan now? The plan is we're going to have a beauty pageant. Exactly what's going to go on, a beauty pageant of the most beautiful women in the world. We're about to face the Miss Persia contest, right? And so in this Miss Persia contest, the women are going to be brought in before the king for the king to choose which one will be his new queen. And as we go into the next few verses, as this beauty pageant is unfolding, we find the next 2 key characters in our story. This is verses 5 through 7. It says, now there was a Jew in Susa, the citadel, whose name was Mordecai, the son of Jair, the son of Shimei, the son of Kish, a Benjaminite, who had been carried away from Jerusalem among the captives, carried away with Jeconiah, king of Judah, whom Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, had carried away. Let me catch my breath. Old Testament's got some great names, don't they? Like I always said, why can't we just call him Bob or Sally or Tom or whatever? Why do you have to go with these names? So we move on. He said he was bringing up Hadassah, that is Esther, the daughter of his uncle, for she had neither father nor mother. The young woman had a beautiful figure, was lovely to look at, and when her father and mother died, Mordecai took her as his own daughter. Now these become the 2 main characters of our story, so let me just kind of take a few little details from our passage here about who they are. First of all, let's look at Mordecai. He was a Jew of the tribe of Benjamin. He was living in Susa, the capital of Persia. His great-grandfather Kish had been taken captive by the Babylonians, which means that he was born in exile. And we know, too, that he's the cousin of our next key character, which is Esther. And what he told about Esther, that she's a beautiful woman. In fact, the passage says not only did she have a beautiful face, but she had a beautiful figure. And beyond her beauty, it says that she was an orphan. That means her parents had died, so Mordecai steps in and takes the role of her father. And as we begin to see verses 8 through 14, Esther is now what? She's placed in this beauty pageant for the king. And what's powerful is every step along the way, what does our passage tell us? That she receives favor in the eyes around her. And we're going to see that that favor came from God himself. And I'll show you those verses. But before I do, I want to make a very important point about the spiritual state of where Esther and Mordecai were at this point in our story. Because when we talk about Mordecai, especially Esther, what comes to your mind? God-fearing woman, right? Faithful to what God has called. She was raised up by God at a very moment to respond faithfully to what God has called her to do. But I want you to understand that doesn't happen until later in our story. Because at this point right now, spiritually, you know where they're at? Mordecai and Esther are at a point of being comfortable and compromising within the culture that they lived in. We find in verses 10 and 20 that Mordecai told Esther twice not to reveal her Jewish identity. Now, there's probably reasons for that, and a lot of those are to protect them. But I'll tell you that they were more concerned about their own status and protection than fulfilling what God had called them to do at this point. Beyond the fact that he wouldn't want to reveal his identity, it says that in the passage that it appears that Mordecai gave approval for Esther to join the royal harem. A harem is a collection of women that are there to serve the king. There are some benefits about being part of that. Food, shelter, but there are a lot of challenges because when you're part of that harem, guess who owns you? The king. You are his possession. He determined the value of your life. And not only is he seemed to be given approval for her to join that, but what does it seem like? That he is approving her and trying to encourage her to be chosen as the next queen of Persia. What's the problem with that? If Mordecai and Esther are faithful followers of God, that they know the Mosaic law, they are not to intermingle or marry people that are not of the Jewish faith. In fact, on your own, read Ezra chapter 9, verses 1 through 4, because when Ezra comes back to the land where they were living, he rebukes the people and says, why are you living like this? Why are you intermingling? And so here we see, and I don't want to read into the passage more than what's there. We have to always be cautious to do that. But it appears to be in every step of their decision at this point that they're trusting in themselves rather than trusting in God. That they are spiritually apathetic or spiritually indifferent. And why do I share that? Because, man, so many times in our lives, doesn't that happen to us? That we're going through life indifferent to what God is doing in the scenes behind our lives, indifferent to our choices, trusting in ourselves and what we want, rather than saying, God, what do you want? But the power is maybe today you are making choices that God is saying, where are you going? Why are you doing this? But just as we see in the life of Esther and Mordecai, that God is still actively involved in the scenes of their lives, behind the scenes of their life. And so too, God is the same in our lives, working behind the scenes to lead us to a point where we can see the plan that He has for our lives unfold. Now, understand where they're at spiritually. Let's look where God was at. Because what we see at every step of Esther's life, God's unseen hand working in both her and Mordecai, even when they appear to be unaware, which is so often in our lives. We're like, God, I just don't see where you're at. But God says, don't you know that I've been here the whole time? And so we go to verse 9, and here we see that the young woman referring to Esther pleased him. Who's him? Well, the passage tells us that is Haggai, who was in charge of the women, and that she had received his favor. And by receiving his favor, she was given special treatment and privileges. It's almost like this guy, Haggai, who's in charge of this beauty contest, right? And preparing the women for it. He encounters Esther, and Esther receives favor to where, you know what? He's standing in the background trying to encourage her, trying to support her so she can become the next queen. But besides receiving his favor, verse 15 says, now Esther was winning favor in the eyes of all who saw her. Then we go to verse 17, and it says she wins ultimately the favor of the king. This is what it says. The king loved Esther more than all the women, and she won grace and favor in his sight more than all the virgins. So they set the royal crown on her head and made her queen instead of Vashti. You know, you can look at it from the details of this is just luck and circumstances. No, it's not, ladies and gentlemen, because the God that I serve, that I've seen involved in this church, that I've seen involved in my life, is involved in Esther. And every step of the way, He is placing her where He needs her and giving her favor that she needs to accomplish His purpose. And see, right now you may be facing challenges and difficulties, but God is saying, if you remain faithful to me, I promise you, I will give you favor in the eyes of those who need to have that for you to accomplish what I need you to do. And along with the details of Esther's life, where do we see God working as well? In the life of Mordecai. Because you go into verse 19. Mordecai happened to be at the right place at the right time. You've heard that phrase, right? And there he is, right place at the right time, because where he's at, he overhears an assassination plot against the king. And he goes and shares that with Esther, who goes back to the king and tells him that. And we might not think anything of it, but you know what? In a few chapters later, we're going to see that God had him at the right time, at the right place at the right time, because later on that is going to become a key event in God bringing about His purpose and plans for the Jewish people. What a powerful thing to see, that although God's name is absent in our story, He is working behind the scenes with an unseen hand to bring everything together for what He has planned and determined. So what's the challenge for us as we reflect upon these first two chapters? It is this: we need to surrender to what God is doing in our lives. You see, right now, God's unseen hand is working in your life. And the question is, how will you surrender to what He is doing, even if you're unaware of it? I had a conversation with someone this week. I'll tell you what, it could be the same conversation I had with anyone in this room, even myself. And they were telling me that an opportunity, a door had opened up in his life, and they were so excited about it because it was going to be a blessing to him and to his family. Financially, the way they could have an influence in so many ways. And as he's going through this process, people that were making that decision for him about whether he would be able to go through that door were constantly affirming that you're the right person. We want you to do this. Then out of nowhere, he gets a phone call and says, we're going in a different direction. And of course, the question, why, Lord? When I see this great plan of you unfolding in my life, why are you diverting me to another way? And how many of us have been there, asked that question, God, what are you doing and why are you doing this? But the advice I gave him is the same advice I'd give you or myself. And this is what I told him. I said, God works in all the details of our lives. And that when we choose to surrender to Him, we get the privilege to look back to see that whatever we had gone through, good and bad, easy and difficult, was being used by God to bring about His will in our lives. In other words, any door that opens or closes, anything you go through, God is saying was not without purpose. That when you surrender and trust me, you will see me bringing about a purpose and a plan of what you're going through. The reality is many of us need to go do that. We need to put a pause in our lives, and like I did with this church, go back and begin to reflect upon where you're at and how you got here. And I promise you, you will begin to see God's unseen hand in your life. But there is a reality too, that God calls us to do something, and we faithfully respond to that call, but we don't see the end result of that call. When I was thinking about the church and all that God had done, I could picture Chuck standing there handing me the keys. And at that moment, Chuck and I had no idea what God had for Truth and Grace. All we knew was that we were responding to His faithful call in our lives. And neither of us knew, too, in a few months that he would no longer be here to be in the presence of the Lord. You see, Chuck didn't get to see the final results. He didn't get to see what's going on here. But one day we'll stand in glory and celebrate that because of his faithfulness, look what God has done. And the joy of seeing his grandchildren, his daughter at the first service, to see them be able to see that because of their grandfather's faithfulness, look at what God has chosen to do when we submit to what He has and not what we necessarily want. A powerful reminder of God's faithfulness. And look, I don't know what situations you are. I know you'll walk out of here and you'll face circumstances and difficulties. And sometimes you're going to walk through and you're going to say, God, you seem to be so absent. I don't know where you're at. And yes, there's going to be some times where you're going to make a decision and you're going to surrender to the Lord and you won't know until you stand before Him the impact of what you did. But here's how I want to encourage you. That even when times when God seems to be silent, or when we do not see the final results, that when we choose to submit to Him, that He will work all things out for good. I love this verse, and I pray that you guys will hear this verse. This is what it says in Romans 8:28. And we know. It doesn't say we think. It says we know that for those who love God, all things work together for good, for those who are called according to His purpose. In my life as a pastor, and even before I was here at Truth and Grace, I've sat with many people through some difficult challenges. And when you have a faith and trust in Christ, the truth of that means so much. Because even though you can't clearly see, you know that God is a good God who brings everything according to His purpose. But I want to close here in prayer. And before I do, I have to be very honest with you. To receive the blessing of knowing that God is working in your life for your good, you know what that requires us to do? It requires us to go to the cross. Because the blessing comes for those that love God. And how do I know I love God? Is when I surrender to the plan He has. And what's the initial plan that God has in my life? It's not all these blessings. It's not all these great things. You know what God says? The plan begins very simple, BJ. Humble yourself before my Son and give your life over to Him. Allow His sacrifice on that cross to cleanse you free, to experience richness and fellowship with me. And today is the day that if you want to begin to experience the beauty of what that passage says, surrender your life to Christ. And I can promise you, the God who gave His life on that cross for you, that when you walk through difficulties of life and you say, God, you seem so absent, I don't know what you're doing, He is reminding you that just as I was present on that cross when I took your sins upon me, that I am present right now and I am working everything out for good. Let's go to the Lord in prayer.